Before we transition to how these various perceptual biases can impact organizational decision making, and also start talking about how we can use this information about social perception, for basically social identity theory, and these perceptual biases to aid in our understanding of how to do training and learning in the workplace, I want to talk about one final perceptual bias, and that's called self-fulfilling prophecy. And the general case of self-fulfilling prophecy occurs when a manager forms expectations of workers. They therefore behave consistent with these expectations, and then the manager's behavior affects the workers to where the workers respond to how they're treated by managers. So we actually find a fair amount of evidence that we are reactive to how people treat us. So if we're being treated as a top performer, if we're being treated positively, if we are being given opportunities to use our skills, we tend to perform better. Likewise, no matter what our skill set and motivation is, if those that are actually managing us basically perceive us as not being as effective, not giving us opportunities, and not letting us use our skill sets, we're more likely to underperform. The Pygmalion effect is basically the positive expectations. So basically, if someone provides emotional and professional support, the added experience and boosted confidence results in good performance. And this was first actually demonstrated in experiments done within grade schools, where basically instructors, teachers, were informed randomly that certain students were expected to do well. This was not based on any previous experience. This was not based on their grades. This was randomly determined. At the end of the school year, those students had actually improved far more significantly than those that had not been identified as top performers. In other words, the instructors expected good things out of the students. They tended to give those students more experiences, give those students more support, and therefore those students blossomed. The Gollum effect is the exact reverse of this, the negative expectations. Emotional and support is withheld, limited experiences and lower confidence is given, and therefore poorer performances. And there are some studies that have found this as well in limited settings. So again, just recognize that how you treat others will affect, to some degree, how they perform. Now, again, these are averages. We talked about stereotypes earlier, and I really want to point out that all of these behaviors are for most people in most situations. There's always going to be what we call outliers. There's going to some people that no matter what situation you put them in, they're going to underperform, and there's certain people that no matter what situation you put them in, may overperform. But again, we want to set up an environment based on what we know about human behavior and based on what we know about psychology to ensure the highest likelihood that everyone tends to excel. So how do we apply these organizational applications? Probably the biggest one is basically performance appraisals, the process of evaluating employees in various work-related dimensions. By its very nature, there's an inherent bias to this process, and that's because we have to assess how much time does the manager actually have to gather meaningful data on performance. Sometimes you can be praised and criticized for the same things, and also you may be getting information, both positive and negative, on the same events from various people that you have to report to. Very few of us in the workplace truly only have one manager. There are objective measures, and one of the things that we want to push towards, that based on what we know about biases, is to use those objective measures as much as possible. Sales numbers, athletes, stats, etc. You can think of a fair amount of examples: number of absentees, number of sick days, number of time late, number of customer service complaints. All of those would be objective measures. Now, they may still have bias, but at least they're numbers that everyone would agree on. So you can definitely make an argument, for example, that sales numbers might be affected by the people that are actually buying the products, which would therefore include bias. But at the end of the day, if 7 different people look at the same sales number for that particular quarter, they'll all see the same number. Now, that's not going to capture all performance, and in fact, performance appraisal, once we've determined what objective measures can be measured, probably does involve some softer skills and some basically ratings of how that person is performing in their job. And this may be more objective, or less objective, I should say, and more subjective. And when we talk about objective versus subjective, an objective measure is one that multiple people would all agree on the score. So, for example, your height. If you walk up to a tape measure and that tape measure is accurate and it measures you at 6'2", if 7 different people looked at you standing next to that tape, they would all agree 6'2". That's an objective measure. Now, does that height measure actually reflect performance? Probably not. So objectivity is not the only thing we have to think about. But objectivity at least means that there will not be disagreement on the number itself. Simply, there might be disagreement on what that number means and how useful that is to measuring performance. Subjective measures are measures that there might be some disagreement on. So we might have 3 people watch you give a 15-minute presentation and rate your presentation skills on a 1 to 5. Someone might rate you a 4, someone might rate you a 3, and someone might rate you a 5. That again means that there is some subjectivity there. Not everyone who saw the exact same behavior rates you the same. Generally speaking, one of the things that we can do to reduce bias in subjective ratings is, one, have multiple raters and average those ratings. That tends to get us to a more accurate score. But also we can provide training about the biases we've already discussed in these modules to basically reduce the likelihood that at least if there's a difference in those scores, it's coming from irrelevant information or biased information. Now, recognizing that the organizational application is usually going to be some form of decision making, whether it's performance appraisal, promotions, or pre-hire, a lot of people will make efforts at impression management. So impression management is efforts by any individual, especially in employment interviews, to improve how they appear to others. It's basically communicating that you are a positive person, that you're a good fit, that you're a people person, that you have no flaws. Generally speaking, we try not to talk about anything negative when we talk about ourselves, especially if we're looking for a promotion or to be hired. It's one of the reasons that sometimes we'll actually focus on structured interviews in employment interviews to try to make sure that we're asking questions that really don't have positive answers. If you've ever had that question of what is your greatest weaknesses, that's an attempt to make you kind of break out of impression management. Now, again, you're probably still going to try to manage that as well and how you answer it, but we also want to recognize that whenever we're interviewing someone, not only are we trying to get to accurate ratings that are bias-free, at the same time, they're going to be trying to manage their own impressions of what they're giving you as far as that information. So this is a big chart of various types of impression management that we can find and the percentage of people that actually use them. So self-promotion, describing oneself in a positive manner for the situation at hand, i.e. kind of focusing on our work ethics, etc. 100% of people doing interviews have reported using some form of self-promotion. Personal stories, describing past events that make oneself look good. In my old job, I worked in late anytime I needed. So in other words, not just promoting, but also supporting that promotion with stories. And again, 96% of people report doing this in interviews. Opinion conformity, expressing beliefs that are assumed to be held by the target, agreeing with something the interviewer says. So basically this is whether or not you actually agree with it. A lot of times people doing an interview may look up the company, look up the company's values, and there may be a couple of company values that aren't necessarily in line with your own, but you might very well mention this. And this is where we start to see the drop-off. So only about 54% of people suggest that they do this. Entitlements, claiming responsibility for successful past events, even if one was not necessarily. So I was responsible for the 90% sales increase that resulted when actually it was a team effort, about 50%. Other enhancements, making statements that flatter, praise, or compliment the target. I'm very impressed with your company's growth in recent years, 46%. Enhancements, claiming that positive events were more positive than they really were, about 42%. Overcoming obstacles, so describing specifically what was in the environment that made it harder for you to do your work and how you got over it, again, 33%. Justification, if there is something that's negative brought up, accepting responsibility for poor performance, but doing it with negative implications. Our team didn't win a lot, but that's just how you play the game when it really matters. So again, justifying potential losses, 17%, and making excuses. I didn't complete the application form because the placement counter ran out of them. So basically, it was someone else's fault, about 13%. So we can see that a lot of different forms of impression management are often used in interviews, as this study in itself shows. And a lot of times, another thing to remember is think about those biases and use these to your advantage. So one of those biases is similar to me. The more you can learn about the person giving the interview, and the more you can say that you are similar to that person. So for example, if you ask the interviewer, so tell me a little bit about yourself. What do you like? If they respond and give you a few things, agree with those things. Also, generally speaking, people actually come out of interviews where they've actually talked more than the person they're interviewing, more positive than if they don't get a chance to talk much at all. So the more you can ask questions back, it's one of the reasons at the end of an interview, a lot of times they'll say, do you have any questions? One of the worst answers you can give is, no, I don't have any questions. You should have 2 or 3 questions because you're wanting to let the person actually respond and talk themselves. They're going to remember that interview as being more positive. So not only do we want to be aware of these biases, we also want to be aware of them when we're in the reverse role to where they can be used to our advantage to help us get a job or a promotion. So additional organizational applications include corporate image, so the impressions that corporations project to people. So basically think about what's your image of the following company. So each one of these links, if you go to the original PowerPoint, these links should still be active. And there are various examples of companies trying to set up a corporate image. So Walmart often goes home for the holidays is one of their catchphrases. Anheuser-Busch is head for the mountains. Philip Morris, this is an interesting piece where it's dated, but basically it's an executive from Philip Morris trying to equate smoking with eating applesauce, and both of them being basically the same thing. That's again impression management, trying to kind of change the topic. Hallmark, above average parents, again another commercial, and Allstate, of course, probably all of us have heard the commercial that you're in good hands when you're with Allstate. So all of these are examples of organizations trying to do this impression management as well, trying to come forward in the most positive light possible to paint themselves as a positive organization for their customer base. So having kind of talked about biases, how we determine who we are ourselves, and how we then use that information in organizations, let's also start talking about what that information tells us about how to better do training and learning in an organization. So first, we want to just go over some basic concept of learning. So learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior occurring as a result of experience. That's a pretty academic description right there, but that's basically what we're trying to do. We are trying to change behavior. So when we are teaching someone, especially in a business setting, what we are trying to do is teach them a new skill, a new way of doing things, hoping that they'll actually do that skill, do that behavior. And that behavioral change is occurring as a result of experiences being the training. So at its core, we also want to look at basically operant conditioning, or again, from cognitive psychology, kind of how we can talk about reinforcement of behaviors. So a lot of organizational interventions that occur to address issues in organizations, whether it's bias, whether it's harassment, whether it is absenteeism, at their core are some form of operant conditioning. So even though we're not necessarily talking about B.F. Skinner and his study of pigeons, we are still building on that knowledge in how we design studies and training. So operant conditioning is the form of learning in which people associate the consequence of their actions with the actions themselves. So behaviors with positive consequences are acquired. Eating your favorite food for the first time, you really enjoyed it, you eat it more often. And behaviors with negative consequences tend to be eliminated. Grabbing a bee when you're a kid. So we very quickly learn to associate when we do any behavior. If the behavior results in a positive consequence, that behavior is likely to increase. If the behavior results in a negative consequence, that behavior tends to decrease. So at its most core level, if an organization is trying to do training, what it's trying to do is increase the positive behaviors by rewarding them and decrease the negative behaviors by some form of punishment. So when we look at operant conditioning learning, the steps in operant conditioning is to determine the antecedents, the conditions leading up to the behavior. So when is the behavior most likely to occur? We then look at the behavior itself when the activity is performed, and then we look at the consequences, the result of the behavior. So an example of an operant conditioning process is manager shows employee how to do a new job. So basically training is occurring. That's the antecedent. There's training. Employee performs the job properly. That's the behavior. Manager praises the employee. That's the consequence. So when we're thinking about increasing the likelihood of successful training in an organization, at its most basic level, we want to think about the antecedents. How do we set up a situation, whether it's training or whether it's simply just a management style, that results in the behavior that we're wanting to be more likely? Once the behavior is actually shown and shown properly, we want to make sure that the consequences follow it fairly quickly and that there's praise or reward. So ending up on these concepts of operant conditioning, the reinforcement concepts here are basically a few here. We have positive reinforcement, the process by which people learn to perform behaviors that lead to a presentation of desired outcomes. you get a raise for increasing sales. And what we generally find with positive reinforcement is it's easy to do in a lab. It's a little more difficult in the real world because we want to be able to identify the positive behaviors, but only the positive behaviors, and then we want to provide a positive reinforcement to that behavior. We want to add something to the environment, whether it's a raise, whether it's a bonus, whether it's a gold star, or whether it's just praise. But that praise, that reinforcement, does need to come shortly thereafter the behavior. So the longer the separation between the behavior and the reward, the less likely the actual reinforcement occurs. And when you think about most workplaces, your main reward is usually pay. It's usually not contingent on necessarily any specific behavior. As long as you're performing at a certain minimum level, you get that pay. You're probably getting it every week, every 2 weeks, or some form therein. So when we think about adding positive reinforcement to an organization, we have to start to go above and beyond just pay usually. We have to come up with ways that we're going to be able to provide relatively immediate feedback to positive behaviors. Negative reinforcement is the process by which people learn to perform acts that lead to the removal of an undesired effect. By doing what your boyfriend or girlfriend wants, you stop nagging them. So this could be, negative reinforcement can be if you're underperforming, your direct supervisor is constantly checking in on you, constantly changing or giving you corrections. But when you actually start performing better, that negative reinforcement disappears. So both of these are about reinforcing a behavior. Positive reinforcement is about adding rewards. Negative reinforcement is about removing punishments. So it's not about adding a punishment. It's about actually, if you perform well, you no longer have to deal with this negativity. So again, punishment is about decreasing undesirable behaviors, and extinction is the process through which responses are no longer reinforced and tend to gradually diminish in strength. So basically what we found is that, again, when we look at operant conditioning, there is an advantage to some degree of punishment, but for the most part, we don't use punishment in most organizations. Punishment is a little more tricky. It is not that the research doesn't support the addition of punishment, either positive punishment or negative punishment. I remove the punishment or I add the punishment. The problem is that generally punishment, if it is not consistently provided immediately after the negative behavior, think about how basically punishment works in the real world. You don't know what fire is. You put your hand in, it burns. That's punishment. It's a very quick and fast response. I put my hand in fire, it burned, I'm never going to put my hand in fire again. For it to work in a workplace, it has to be somewhat like that as well. The actual punishment itself has to be strong enough to change the behavior quickly, and it has to immediately follow the behavior. And that's a fairly difficult thing to do in most organizations. That's why most organizations mainly focus on positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And finally, just ending up, extinction. When a behavior is never rewarded, it is never seen as being positive, it doesn't remove negative consequences and it doesn't add positive consequences, it tends to extinguish, which means it's no longer likely to occur. So we're going to build on these concepts as we move into more complex thoughts on how to do learning and training in organizations in the final module of this set.